Gerrymandering is a rot at the heart of American democracy. Let's take a look at the damage done and what to do about it. Before anything else, let's get a quick refresher on what gerrymandering is. In short, gerrymandering is where you adjust how you draw an electoral map to change and influence the outcomes of elections. Let's take a look more specifically. Here we have an illustrated example. Let's take a look at this chart of little squares on the left. Each red square represents a red voter, and each blue square represents a blue voter. Additionally, it's not just a count of the number of voters, but it also represents where they live. So let's pretend this is a nice little square imaginary town with red voters living on the left side and blue voters living on the right side. If we wanted to draw perfectly representative districts, you would draw them vertically. One here, one here, one here, one here, and one here. That would lead to 3 blue districts and 2 red districts, which would also be perfectly representative of the actual underlying population. The 2 graphs to the right illustrate ways you could gerrymander it, though, to change that outcome. Blue could gerrymander it to secure their advantage in majority status and entirely lock red out of all seats by drawing the districts horizontally. Additionally, red can actually win a majority of seats even though it is in the minority if it gets control of the districting process and is able to draw some particularly creatively drawn districts. And here we can see this case leads to 3 red representatives and 2 blue representatives, a reversal of the majority-minority status. So that's what gerrymandering is, but what's the impact? Well, on our stream, we read multiple different studies and reports estimating the impact of gerrymandering and found that in general, gerrymandering seems to consistently give an advantage to Republicans in terms of the number of seats they control and allow for the election of more conservative politicians than would be elected otherwise. Different studies estimated different impacts for the number of seats shifted by gerrymandering. Let's start on the lower end, looking at a study that came out of Tufts University. The Tufts University study took real-life voter data, but essentially attempted to redraw non-gerrymandered districts over that voter data to see what the results would be if there was no gerrymandering. They found that on net, it only shifted 1 seat over to Republicans. Now this is a concrete advantage being given to Republicans. They gain a single seat, but it is not a particularly severe advantage. That said, this study was on the lower end of the estimates. Compare it in contrast to a study out of the Center for American Progress that also attempted to estimate the impacts of gerrymandering. In their case, they looked at divides between the popular vote and the actual amount of representatives won with that popular vote to estimate what the impacts of gerrymandering were. They found instead that there were 59 highly gerrymandered seats, and among those 59 seats, Republicans held a net advantage of 19 total seats. Though it's not possible to perfectly estimate the number of seats that are shifted by gerrymandering, these studies should help give us an idea of at least the range that we're looking at. That at least somewhere between a very small handful and a dozen or more seats are being shifted over to Republicans in the House of Representatives by the gerrymandering process. However, seats are not the only thing impacted by the gerrymandering process. It also changes the nature of politicians that get elected. So this is a complicated graph. Stick with me for a second here. This graph on the y-axis charts the DW nominate score. So what is a DW nominate score? Essentially, it's a measure of how liberal or conservative you are, with a 1 being a perfect conservative and a -1 being a perfect liberal. So we can see that the scale runs from just about 1 down to about -0.5. Additionally, on the x-axis, we can see that it has the statewide share of the Democratic vote, where states where Democrats are getting most of the vote are to the right, and states where Democrats are getting less of the vote are to the left. Finally, plotted on the graph, we can actually see the outcomes of elections, and there are 3 separate trend lines drawn through these graphs. And we can see that there is a large Democratic EG. EG stands for efficiency gap, an intermediate efficiency gap, and a large Republican efficiency gap. In terms of understanding what an efficiency gap is essentially if you have an efficiency gap in your favor, it means that a state has been gerrymandered in your favor. So what this is essentially showing is what is the impact of gerrymandering on how liberal or conservative the elected politician is by how liberal or conservative the state is. So it controls for conservative states, liberal states. The politicians' values are here. So it's essentially politician values, state values, and then where they ended up. So here, when we have a large democratic efficiency gap, we can see that in moderate and conservative states, it leads to more liberal candidates getting elected because they are lower on the graph, they are more liberal. However, once you actually start to get into more liberal states, there actually is no advantage to Democrats in gerrymandering. Additionally, if we take a look at the intermediate process, this essentially sets a baseline for when there isn't any gerrymandering going on. This is the relationship between how conservative the state is and how conservative the politician is. We can see quickly overall that generally the conservatives that get elected in highly conservative states are significantly more conservative than the liberals are liberal who get elected in liberal states. In any case, finally, taking a look at what happens when you have a large Republican advantage in gerrymandering, you can see that when you have a Republican advantage in gerrymandering, in all cases, it leads to more conservative politicians getting elected, both in liberal states and in more conservative states. This is unique to conservatives, and it is not a trend replicated amongst liberals. In short, that graph essentially demonstrates that gerrymandering not only provides additional seats to Republicans, but that it also allows within those seats for more conservative representatives to get elected. There is, in certain situations, a similar effect when liberal gerrymandering is occurring that allows for more liberal representatives to be elected, but it is not as universal or significant as it is for conservatives. So, we've seen the problem of gerrymandering. Now the question is, how can we fix it? Unfortunately, the original avenue that folks were approaching was the justice system, and unfortunately, that didn't play out well. In 2019, in Rucho versus Common Cause, the Supreme Court ruled that issues of political gerrymandering were non-judiciable, which essentially means you can't even bring them up in court. This is one of the strongest possible opinions the court could lay out, essentially saying you don't even have a right to argue this in court. They viewed it strictly as a political rather than legal issue. This Supreme Court decision was likely motivated by two primary things. First, which we can't rule out, is simple partisan bias. It was a conservative court issuing a ruling that helped conservatives politically. Could that be political bias? Very likely. However, if we want to be charitable and assume that political bias is not a part of the process, it still doesn't end up looking particularly good for the court. It looks like the Supreme Court has an out-of-date understanding of partisanship in the United States based on the Cold War, and that is probably the worst era to base your partisanship estimations on. Consider this graph, which shows the cross-partisan overlap in the US Senate. Here we can see the percent of overlapping members by year among Senate Democrats, and I promise you the graph for the Republicans looks approximately the same, but no need to look at two graphs when one will do. Here we can see the percent of the overlap in their DW nominate scores. So we can see the black line is those that have a 10% overlap. This is the proportion of members that have a 25% overlap in their scores. And then finally, this is the percentage of members that have a 50% overlap in their scores. In short, these are areas where Senate Democrats have overlapping DW nominate scores with Senate Republicans. We can see that prior to 1921, there's essentially none. And after 1993, once again, there are essentially none. The Cold War is an extremely anomalous time in US history in terms of bipartisanship. And yes, I know not all of this is not the Cold War, right? It's, Cold War starts in 1945, so it's really this portion of the graph over. But once again, if you go from 1945 over, you can see that it is very much an anomalous time for bipartisanship, and if you're using this as your basis for the nature of bipartisanship in the United States, you are going to get it wrong. And that seems to be what the Supreme Court did. Combine things like that graph with the fact that practices like ticket splitting in your voting have fallen by 2/3 since the 1970s, and the Supreme Court's opinion on bipartisanship begins to look hopelessly antiquated. Justice Roberts wrote, "Many voters split their tickets. Others never register with a political party and vote for candidates from both major parties at different points during their lifetimes." Unfortunately, as this has been declared a non-judiciable issue, this will not be resolvable in the courts for quite some time. This means that we will need to resolve the issue of gerrymandering via political processes, which means that you need to get the very people that are advantaged by gerrymandering to agree to give it up, not necessarily the easiest of sells. That said, it has already begun, with 7 states in the country already having instituted non-partisan districting processes to take politicians out of the districting process. Let's take a look at where that stands. Here in this graph, we can see in green the states that have already instituted non-partisan districting procedures. In yellow, we can see all of the states that still have yet to institute non-partisan districting procedures. And in terms of gray, we can see the states that don't even have a districting process because they only have a single congressional district. However, there was a lot of yellow in that map, and that's where the battle has to take place. If you happen to live in one of those yellow states, consider looking up which of your local state representatives are in favor of a nonpartisan districting process and try to throw your weight behind them. Try and throw your support behind them. That is a real concrete step you can take to fight against gerrymandering in your state if it still exists in your state. Anyway, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your attention. I mean, goodness gracious, that is a precious thing in the modern era. If you made it this far, please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, hit the little bell for notifications. You know the whole shill drill. We have a stream. Please consider checking that out. We go into way more detail on stream than we do in these videos. In any case, I am your host, Friendo. Thank you so much for checking out this video, and until my next one, as always, peace!